கலாநிதி சுதா நடராஜா அவர்களை இங்கே வருமாறு அன்போடு அழைக்கிறோம். I would like to call upon Dr. Sutha Nadaraja, a lecturer of International Relations at School of Oriental and African Studies. அவர் இன்று கதைக்கவிருக்கிற தலைப்பு மிக முக்கியமானது. அமெரிக்கா, இந்தியா ஆகிய நாடுகளின் உறவுகள் ஈழத்தமிழர்களுடைய பிரச்சனை தொடர்பாக என்பது தலைப்பாக இருக்கிறது. US-India relationship in the context of Elam Tamils. Dr. Sutha, please take a podium.
For inviting me. I wasn't sure what to talk about today, but in discussion with Gobi, it was felt that some reflections on the state of international affairs that affect the Tamil struggle after the Indian elections would be of some interest. So what I'm proposing to do today is talk a little bit about what the changes in India mean for India, and then based on how that works out internationally to see how it might impact on our politics. So clearly these were unusual elections. They were not, it's expected the BJP would win, but not so convincingly, and not so convincingly on its own. The BJP took 280 seats, which means it can form a government under any circumstances on its own. Its alliance took 330 odd seats. And at the same time in Tamil Nadu, the AIDMK swept the state, taking 37 out of 39. By any measure, these are remarkable outcomes. For the first time, a single party can drive Indian policy, national and foreign. First time in 30 years. And it is the BJP, not the Congress, which has created this sort of broad base of support. Meanwhile, the AIDMK's victory was also in excess of what many people, the wildest predictions of how well they would do. Now, there are many reasons why these election results have come about, but the number one reason is the economy. For better or worse, over the last so many years, the Congress Party's management of the Indian economy is seen to have been poor at best. On top of that, a number of corruption scandals and the general sense that India is not doing well. And that's pervasive across the state, across the country. Meanwhile, by contrast, in Tamil Nadu, despite the to and fro politics, there's a general sense the state is being well managed. Right? So no matter what the politics on stage are, day-to-day people feel that as a management of their lives, the AIDMK is doing pretty good. So the economy is central to both these outcomes. Now, having won the elections on a promise of a better future very quickly, the BJP is faced with a powerful mandate, but also a significant challenge. If they don't deliver growth and jobs and the general upliftment of Indians on average, they will not win the next elections. Right? There's a huge amount of expectation, a huge amount of hope. What this means is that the overriding priority for the BJP in the coming years is going to be the economy. Everything else is going to be secondary. Everything else will be understood in terms of how it will help contribute to the economic revival of the country. Now you'll notice that China has had a very similar policy for decades. Everything China does is about its economy. So it will support some states, oppose some states. The calculation is what's in it for us economically. So if the BJP is going to turn India around, if it's going to regenerate, revive the economy, generate growth, generate jobs, it needs two things. First, it needs better international relations. It's not possible to turn around an economy the size of India without significant inflows of investment and a significant expansion of trade. In short, India has to make and sell stuff abroad. At the same time, the kind of reforms that India is going to undertake over the next few years, and quite quickly I would imagine, are going to require a certain amount of stability at home. You can't push through the kinds of reforms that are demanded without the support, at least not vigorous opposition, of several major states. So my proposal today is to work through internationally what this election is likely to um, result in changes of, and the same thing domestically. The basic argument is this: the overriding priority for the BJP government will be economic revival. If it is to meet the massive mandate and expectations on which it came to power and elected again, then it'll be based entirely on how well it does this. And in short, it needs good relations, in particular with the United States and Europe, and internally, it needs good relations with a number of key states. These are Andhra Pradesh, Gujarat, Maharashtra, and Tamil Nadu. These are the industrialized centers, the engines of the Indian economy. So, in the remaining time, I'm going to work through international connections, domestic connections, and then pull back and say something about how this will impact on what we can and what we should do. Now, after the end of the Cold War, in the early 90s, no state in the world could decide on domestic or foreign policy without some consideration of what the US and the West more generally will do. They're simply not possible. And even countries like China recognized this quickly and began to work in a way that would bring in US and Western investment in as much volume as possible. By contrast, India took a much more measured route. It was very slow. It began to open up its economy, began to lower its barriers, but it took some time. Now, during the Cold War, India's position was officially non-aligned. That means that in the superpower struggle, they were not going to join one camp or the other. In practice, India was aligned with Russia. It's the most important military relationship they've ever had, and it continues to this day. Even in the last few years, nuclear relations and high-tech weaponry, they turn to Russia in the main. Now, in opening up to the economy, opening up their economy to the world, they effectively were seeking to join an economy already dominated 30 or 40 years by the US and other Western states. And in that process, there has been a struggle on how exactly India should do that. Realizing that it needs to grow the economy, it began to drop barriers selectively. So US-India relations kind of rolled along in the 90s without any major change. They were still continuing a Cold War policy of we're friends but not great friends. And there was a bump in 1998 when the new BJP government decided that they would test their nuclear weapons. Right? And effectively told the world, we are a nuclear power. Now the problem with that was the international community has a hostility to new nuclear powers. And so the immediate result was the West, in particular the US, imposed strict sanctions on India and on Pakistan, which tested its weapons a few days later. Now, the US did this very reluctantly. The Clinton administration didn't want to do it, but if they had to uphold the basic idea that states should not acquire nuclear weapons, they had to do something. But no sooner had they imposed the sanctions, they began to look around for ways to undo those sanctions. And when the Bush administration took power, they made good relations with India a key foreign policy priority. So in the period of the Bush administration, the first Bush administration, there was a huge amount of optimism in the US about India. This is a democracy, it's 1 billion people, it's a massive economic potential, they speak English, it's all good. So the problem is this hope over a certain period of time turned to disillusionment that they're just not doing what we think they should do. In effect, instead of rising, it's hard to remember this, but in 2000, people spoke about India and China as peers, as two states that are comparable. Now, 10 years later, China's taken off and India's kind of bumping along the road, right? And as a result, if you look at international affairs today, people look to see what China is doing. They don't always look to see what India is doing. So how do we explain these two outcomes? Well, firstly, there's confusion in Indian foreign policy making about what India should be on the world stage, or what kind of role should India have. Now, for some people, they view India's role as unique and distinctive. It's a big state, but it doesn't throw its weight around the world. It's kind of non-aligned, it'll always be non-aligned. So this kind of approach where they don't engage with any state closely, they're not hostile to any state in an absolute way, is one set of views. Another set of views, that particularly from the late 90s, is that India is a big power. We're a big power and we should become a bigger power. And that's why the testing of the nuclear weapons, the hardline positions against Pakistan, and so on, become a central kind of driving logic. Now, if you ask these analysts, they would say there's nothing to connect us to the US, nothing to connect us to China. They are permanent rivals. Now, another set of people take the view that in the world, India should be a good citizen. We should be part of the international community. We should help to maintain global order, global stability, and we should partner with other states, in particular the West. Now, if you look at Indian foreign policy making over time, these different ideas come to fore at different times. Some months, India seems to be very pro-US. Next month, they seem to be aggressive and belligerent. The point about this is that there is no fixed direction in which foreign policy will always go. It's always worked out through repeated struggles inside the Indian establishment. Now, another aspect of why this keeps fluctuating is every time India engages with the international community, it produces massive changes at home. A good example would be privatization. When they open up the economy and they implement these reforms, effectively the local economy, whether in a particular state or across the country, starts to change. And we'll see a lot more of this in the coming years as the BJP aggressively follows a neoliberal economic reform policy. Just take for example, one of the main contributions the Bush administration made to bring India into a Western framework was to allow India to acquire nuclear material and nuclear technology abroad. Now, under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, countries are not allowed to acquire this kind of technology unless they sign the NPT treaty. Iran, for example, has not signed it. But in India's case, the US decided there must be an exception. India is unique. It's a democracy. So even though they won't sign the treaty, it's okay if we supply them with nuclear weapons, material for nuclear weapons. The consequence of this was, although the relationship between US and India started to come closer, at home it generated huge outrage. A significant amount of resistance, including within Parliament, where members of the ruling coalition quit because they were opposed to it. So it's not simply the case where a country can follow foreign policy without having domestic things to consider. You can kind of see where I'm going with this. The third thing is that states within India are autonomous actors in many ways. Some states have very good relations with the international community that is separate, or at least a little different, to Delhi. A good example is Tamil Nadu. Now, for the last 10 to 20 years, Tamil Nadu has had, on its own, increasingly warm relations with Western states, in particular investors in the automobile industry and other high-tech industries. And this is not something that happens because they come to India and they decide to go to Tamil Nadu. It's rather because Tamil Nadu works to attract foreign capital and competes with other states to do so. Now, Gujarat, from where Prime Minister Modi launched his rise to power, has also reached out internationally, in particular to China. When he was chief minister, he spent a lot of time talking to China. He visited China 4 times to bring investment to India, in particular to Gujarat. The vast majority of Chinese investment in India is in Gujarat. So this should tell you something about how, first of all, states often, the federal states within India often follow relations that are slightly different to what happens in Delhi. Now, both the US involvement in Tamil Nadu and the Chinese involvement in Gujarat have been at odds with the policies in Delhi, where often there's been an aggressive kind of reaction to China, and there's been a kind of, let's just say, not warm response to US initiatives. So when you think about India and Indian foreign policy, you have to look at all these moving parts to figure out what's really going on at any particular moment. Now, conversely, over the last 10 years or so, countries like Italy, countries like the US, have reached out to Tamil Nadu as long-term relationships. So when the Prime Minister Modi from Italy visited India, he made it a point to go down to Tamil Nadu and build better relations with his government. And most recently, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, when she visited India, also made a point not only to go to Tamil Nadu, but to issue a key foreign policy speech. And if you read that speech, it's very clear that they are, in their dealings with India, seeing two centers of power. Great. Okay. Now, this doesn't mean that these are absolute predictions. There are always twists and turns, and things go up and down. But generally, you can see that these kinds of relations are maintained by constant interactions. Now, last month's elections, first the BJP taking a strong position in Delhi, and then Tamil Nadu having kind of a sweeping mandate for Jayalalitha, suggests that these kind of tensions that have emerged between US-Indian relations will start to change. Part of the reason why the US-Indian relations have weakened over the last 5 to 6 years is because with the Congress government, they did not prioritize the external relations because they were focused on developing the economy in their own way. And being a slightly weaker government, as a coalition, they were constantly having to battle between different parts of their coalition and different states to decide on what should be done. So you find this stop-start kind of approach. Okay, now domestically. When the Indian election started to roll out, there's kind of an expectation that the most important impact on Sri Lanka would be whether the AIDMK will be in coalition in Delhi. Right? So this is the argument. If the BJP wins and Jayalalitha is part of the coalition, it's good for the Tamils. If she is not part of the coalition, it's bad for the Tamils. Right? And this is common in much analysis, not only in the Sri Lankan papers, in Sri Lankan foreign policy, but also in a lot of the Tamil media. Right? So everyone was watching to see, will she be part of the government? Now, when it turns out the BJP could form a government on its own, and Jayalalitha was not part of the coalition, there's kind of celebration and jubilation in Colombo, and sections of the Indian foreign policy establishment who suggest that, well, the BJP is independent, it can do what it likes with regards to Sri Lanka, with Tamil Nadu not being able to influence it. And this is a mistake. It's a misreading of how coalition politics works. Just because you are in a ruling coalition doesn't mean you can affect foreign policy or domestic policy. Good example is this country. We have a two-party ruling coalition, but the junior partner can't make any impact on conservative policies. So just because you're in government doesn't mean you're going to get what you want done. And that's because the only card you can play is I'll quit. Now that's a card you can only play once. And threatening to play the card reduces your influence anyway. It's kind of like threatening to divorce. Now you can only do it once, but if you keep talking about it, it's not going to help improve things. Now, in this particular case, you have to understand what Tamil Nadu's impact on Delhi will be, you have to look at what Delhi is trying to do and what Tamil Nadu's role in that is. And I'll go back to this point. Economic growth, jobs, and economic revival is going to be the #1 priority. For that, you need Tamil Nadu to play ball, to cooperate, to support, and to adopt the policies that you want them to do. So the relationship between the center and Chennai is going to be much more complex than whether Jayalalitha is in the ruling coalition or not. Now, the central point about these economic reforms is, despite all these expectations, is that the privatization, the liberalization, the increasing investment from foreign sources is going to require changes that will produce a lot of anger and dismay within the Indian population, or sections of the Indian population. This is inevitable. And we'll see, we have already seen aspects of this before in terms of protests, in terms of, just as we have in this country, public sector cuts being resisted, and all kinds of mobilizations that will frustrate the ability to drive through these changes. I'm not saying these changes are a good thing or a bad thing for Indians, but to get them done will require force. At the very least, it will require parties in parliament to more or less pass legislation. It's not necessarily the case that the BJP can just drive through legislation and everything will be fine. Many states may resist. They may not implement those policies. So Modi will have to work to make sure Gujarat, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, and so on work unitedly without disruption to help revive the economy as a whole. And then secondly, given that rather than driven centrally, these states have a certain amount of autonomy and are expected to go out and bring in investment on their own. Jayalalitha will have to work hard to make sure that investment comes to Tamil Nadu, not only competing with other Indian states, but also working on their own as a government to reach out to the international community. So, two relations, the US, India, and Delhi, Chennai. These two relationships have been absolutely key to how Sri Lanka has been able to continue its singular nationalist project. Right? For a long time, it is the tensions between the West and India at first, and second, the tensions between Delhi and Chennai that have allowed Sri Lanka to do things. And they have repeatedly played on this fact that if they can keep out Tamil Nadu, if they can keep out the West by reaching to India, or sometimes threatening India by waving China in their face, that these things will improve. Now, after the BJP has come to power, the US-India relationship is likely to improve. It's already quite clear the Americans are reaching out, the Europeans are reaching out, even the Chinese are reaching out. And at the same time, it's clear the Indians are reaching out back. And over the next few weeks and months, the kinds of diplomatic initiatives that are planned suggest that these relationships will start to close up. In the meanwhile, it is quite clear that Tamil Nadu's relationships with Delhi are pretty good. Despite not being in coalition, they're being very careful, being very polite to each other, and it's quite obvious that there's a sign that we should work together, that we don't have any major issues that will separate us. Now, Sri Lanka is an integral part of both those relationships. Almost certainly, when the US deals with India, they'll be talking about Sri Lanka. And already we can see when Tamil Nadu talks to Delhi, they talk about Sri Lanka. Now, this doesn't mean it's all fine, it's all done, and this is the way it's going to work out. What it means is there are new opportunities, right, and new configurations that we should think about in how we influence the encirclement, if you will, of Sri Lanka. There's been the tendency in much analysis to treat the US as a bloc, as one thing, so we talk about US foreign policy, to treat India as a bloc and talk about Indian foreign policy. If you look closely, there are lots of moving parts inside each. In here, in Europe and in North America, Tamil advocacy has successfully got involved in those dynamics. We understand it better. Our advocacy groups are penetrating those networks to try and influence policy. It's quite clear that something important has happened in Tamil Nadu for the Ulam struggle. That never has, as far as I can remember, we've never had this broad and deep recognition that the Ulam question must be taken up, and it's important to them as Indians. So in this new configuration, I think there's a kind of an obligation on us to stop looking at simple blocks and start to look at the complexity of these relationships, to monitor what happens between the US and India, not when someone issues a statement on Sri Lanka, but look at the whole package. What are they working on? How close are they? What are the actual points of disagreement? And the same thing between Chennai and Delhi. You can't just wait for Nadarajaho or someone to say something about Sri Lanka to say, that's what the relationship is. You have to look at what other things they're working more closely on, or what are the problems that are emerging. So that's the broad context. My own view is that we should be quite optimistic. The question is whether we will be able to find ways to exploit the present. Thank you.